Welcome to The Good, the Bad and the Dirty, the secret psychology of persuasion. My name is Natalie Nahai and I'm the web psychologist. I help businesses psychologically optimize their online engagement by applying scientific rigor to their design process. In The Good, the Bad and the Dirty, I'll be sharing strategies and tools with you that you can use to enhance your online presence. Listen weekly as I share new sites, news in online persuasion and the occasional guest star to help you convert more customers online. Make sure you subscribe for free updates at thewebpsychologist.com and get all the resources we mention in the show on the show notes page at thewebpsychologist.com/show-notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please spread the word and rate or review it on iTunes. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #GoodBadDirty. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Good, the Bad and the Dirty. This week, our guest is Dr. Lawrence Ampofo, a data analytics and international affairs professional and founder and director of Semantica Research, a digital data intelligence consultancy based in London and Barcelona. He's a specialist at helping organisations and individuals better serve their customers and stakeholders by providing resources, advisory and events on the ways that digital technologies affect business operations. Lawrence is also the founder of the Digital Mindfulness project, which is fascinating, and it's an exploration of the interactions that exist between practical wisdom and technology. This is actually our second try at this because I messed up the recording last time. So Lawrence has been very generous to come back on the show, and I'd like to welcome you back and say thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me again.
So I'm going to launch with a question around the most recent blog post that you wrote, which sounds just so interesting that I can't not start there. So what did you write about and what is it?
Sure thing. So the most recent blog post I wrote about is entitled Mindfulness in the Machine. And it's really centered on the question of whether software can be mindful or not. So we're also addicted to our smartphones, to our different apps and our different digital technologies. And what I'm really writing about is that these addictions and us being addicted to our technologies, us being stressed by our technologies, and all of these compulsions we have with our tech, these are all really engineered. All of these behaviors are designed by the engineers and by the technologists themselves. And so insofar as all of these behaviors are engineered and they are consciously kind of programmed into the code, this blog post is rather about how can we engineer behaviors that encourage focused, calm, compassionate states of mind which rather bring us back to kind of being human, enhancing what it is to be human rather than making us so kind of focusing rather on these negative addictive qualities.
So what are some of the ways in which we can do that? What are some of the technologies that we've seen that kind of maybe lead us more towards that more desirable state?
It's really interesting into that some of the technologies that we do find that encourage that addictive behavior are some that we just use every day without thinking. So things for example, the infinite scroll. I was reading the work of Nir Eyal, who's utterly fascinating, and he talks about how the infinite scroll that you see on websites like Facebook, like Pinterest, like Instagram, because of course you can never get to the bottom of those websites. You just keep going and going, and he says that in our minds they mimic the function of the slot machines, and so it kind of builds in us a kind of addictive quality just like the slot machines. And so we're just compelled to kind of just do one more swipe. And so basically this whole element of mindfulness in the machine, where I really got this from was from Eyal's work, or his book, which is called The Hook. And the hook is this model that he's devised, which really explains the way that different technologies are created to be so addictive for us. And so going back to that example I was mentioning about infinite scroll, one of the things that triggers within people is this idea called variable reward, so that we're compelled to just do one more swipe, just to see what's at the bottom, because we might get a reward from it. We might see we might see that someone's liked one of our posts. We
Yeah.
might see that something that's directly connected to us has been positively reinforced, or we might not. So this kind of always being, just being in limbo. We might get a reward, we might not. That idea of the variable reward is very much prevalent in our technology today.
And I think it keeps us hunting, seeking, and it's sort of one of the things that's really interesting that you're mentioning about this reward seeking. And we sort of mentioned it on the show elsewhere, this idea of a dopamine loop, the fact that you get these little spikes every now and again. You don't know when they're going to come or how big they're going to be. And so you just end up seeking that hit and the next hit and the next hit. And in fact, that kind of anticipatory sense of reward seems to be stronger in us than the consumative sense of reward. So when you finally do find what you want, which typically, to get a really full experience of satisfaction, it's going to be one of those more deep experiences, such as the kind that you're talking about. So this idea of mindfulness, being really attentive to what's going on and being able to sink in deeper. Yeah, it's fascinating to see if we can use technology to facilitate that kind of deeper sense of satisfaction, as opposed to just getting us to chase our tails, so to speak.
What I was actually writing about in the post is that these technologies are very much being developed by engineers. And so the technology is not being engineered insofar as just for entertainment and just to keep us on the edge, as it were, but rather there are technologies that rather dial into the parts of our brain which encourage deep, focused, meditative, mindful states of mind. So, for example, and I wrote about this in a couple of other posts as well, but the idea of kind of these white noise websites like Coffeefity, for example, which is based on robust scientific research, which shows that a lot of people actually are much better equipped to focusing when they have background noise there. And so you can see, and I think, I did post a link to that, but certainly you can go to this website and then just have the sound of as if you were in a coffee shop at breakfast time or lunchtime or the afternoon. And for me, certainly it does help me to focus a lot more. So yeah.
That's really fascinating, because I actually was thinking about this the other day. I was trying to get motivated to write the book. And there's actually my husband that said, look, just go and sit in a coffee shop, get a cappuccino, just sit and just be around other people so that you've got some stimulation going in, so that then you feel like you're not just having to generate everything yourself. And I thought, that's a really interesting idea. I'll try it. And it did seem to work. Maybe just because I haven't got the association of just misery being chained to my desk. So I'd like to talk a little bit about something else that you've written about, because you write some magnificent posts. And you have written before about this idea of a digital utopia and this kind of extraordinary explosion of technological advancement that we've witnessed over the last few decades or so. As with any kind of environment or ecosystem that undergoes such a rapid rate of change, there's also quite a lot of adjustment that has to go along with it. And so you've created this digital mindfulness conference, which is just extraordinary. And I'd like to maybe ask you what it is that you've created and why it is that it's so important to you as well.
So I think my background with technology is much like everyone else's. I didn't grow up with technology, certainly not having it around me all the time. So when I really started to use technology every single day, that was around 2005. And so once that started to happen, I'd started to notice the different pernicious effects it had on my body. Insofar as my posture, I started to realize that I was, kind of breathing a lot more shallowly when I was sitting down. And then I started to talk to my friends about it, and they kind of corroborated what I was feeling, because they were feeling exactly the same thing. And we started to lament the idea that, we could see phones starting to creep onto dinner tables, that people soon found, they were much more distracted or much more attentive to their phones or to technologies rather than they were to human beings. And so I'm very curious and very naturally curious. And so I wanted to find out more in depth about actually what was going on here. And so that led me very naturally to some of the conferences that are going on about this, like Wisdom 2.0 in San Francisco, which focuses on how one can merge the idea of mindfulness with living with technology. And I thought that was fine, and it was great. I went to one of the conferences in 2014, but I really wanted to take this whole community forward. I really wanted to take it to the next level, because it isn't just the idea of mindfulness meditation that I believe that can enhance our experiences with digital technology, I think is if you're looking at the idea of, for example, practical wisdom, and practical wisdom is the whole idea of doing the right thing at the right time in the right way to your digital experiences, then that opens up an enormous, Pandora's box. It's completely multidisciplinary. Once we start looking at actually how can we interact, how can we create digital experiences that are healthy, that make us happy, that improve the human condition, as it were. And so I created this conference about it, which is taking place in London. And there's another one that's going to be taking place in San Francisco this year, to really bring together people like psychologists like yourself, neuroscientists, spirituality people, technologists, to really start to answer this question of how can we create this, the optimal or perfect digital experience.
So exciting. And it's interesting because it's an approach that I find really fresh in terms of looking at how to harness technology for the greater good. One of the areas that I find particularly interesting is around this idea of well-being and how to harness technologies like yourself, not just for creating better digital experiences, but also for, I suppose, being able to empower people to self-actualize across a variety of ways. So, for instance, if we look at someone like Carol Riff, who's a doctoral researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, she's looked at she actually created 6 scales of psychological well-being, looking at things like self-acceptance and life purpose and autonomy and personal growth. And I think it's really necessary now for people, for us, and for anyone else who's interested to start thinking about ways in which we can actually harness technology to help us improve our lives, as opposed to just feeling as though we're constantly a slave to them. So why do you think we're seeing so many numbers of people now starting to talk about how they're feeling disconnected or feeling like there's a hunger for this kind of work that you're doing? What's changed, do you think?
For me, I think it seems that our human thinking is starting to catch up now with technological development. So for a while, we were just technology was just being created with the idea of increasing productivity. So all of the email programs, all of the office programs, it was very much the idea of being an extension of us, an extension of our minds, right? So if we can kind of produce more, then that would work. But I think now really people are starting to think about what are the effects of this long term on our relationships, our personal and our professional relationships. What are the effects of using this technology on our bodies? And what I could see from my research is that people were having these discussions in different communities around the web. So for example, the well-being people would be speaking about one thing, the technologists themselves would be talking about something else, and the conversation was so disparate. And what I really wanted to do was to bring everything together. And now what I'm finding is that it's actually really important that we do have this discussion because, for example, the way that we use technologies at work, if we were able to design technologies insofar as they could engender a mindful, a calm, focused state of mind that was optimal to encouraging things like creativity and innovation and focus, then that's really important in the workplace in terms of improving productivity, better relationships with customers, with our colleagues, but also then in a personal space, in our homes, if we have better digital experiences in the home, insofar as, again, technologies that can help improve things like self-esteem, can improve things like deep interpersonal connection and compassion. Again, that has positive effects in the home and society-wide, I think. So these are the types of big discussions and big questions that we're starting to ask each other across disciplines.
It's really interesting that you're hearing this from various different places as well, and that there's kind of different ways of attacking it. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like just from a purely academic versus commercial approach that scholars and industry professionals are like showing a huge amount of interest in exploring the potential impact of this kind of practical wisdom that you're talking about, especially when you combine it with digital tech and intelligence and empathy, as well as things like leadership. Are there any examples in particular that you've seen that have caught your imagination of people sort of using technology to start to kind of develop these things already? Is there any tech out there that exists that really inspires you so far, or is that yet to come?
I was really, really encouraged at what was going on with over the West Coast with regards to technology and really engaging with positive human emotions and encouraging positive human habits. So, for example, I was super impressed with what Facebook are actually doing. They're very, very, very concerned with creating positive experiences with their technology, and they're very, very hyper aware of all of the research that's coming out that seems to confirm that, for example, using social networks isn't conducive to things like creating positive connections amongst people, decreasing things like self-esteem amongst people. And so there's a person there. He's one of the directors of engineering. His name is Arturo Bagar. And he gave this amazing talk, in which he was saying what the company is doing in terms of trying to insert, again, this whole idea of mindfulness within the machine, and how they had worked with Pixar artists to create their own set of emojis, which these kind of expressive drawings, which they encourage people to use, to kind of give life or give emotional currency to text. And it was absolutely fascinating, just even that they understood this and that they were trying these different things to kind of really create more positive and more empathetic and more compassionate experiences whilst using Facebook. So,
but do you not think that at some level there's a fight between what's going to make money for the business, and then in terms of immediate gains, and then the whole PR aspect of all this research that's been done to suggest that social media, for instance, with Facebook, actually depletes self-esteem, and it causes people to end up in possibly more negative emotional states than when they started. Obviously, they're doing a lot of work to kind of assimilate other technologies and platforms and create all this other stuff that they can then migrate to. But at what point, perhaps that can be the starting point, but at what point do we have to start considering establishing kind of like a balance between what the customer gets out and what the provider gets out? So in this case, they get data and they get, advertising spend and all the rest of it, and the customer gets utility. Is there not something to be said for kind of empowering customers at an earlier stage to be able to shape the technology that they want themselves? And is that even possible?
Wow, that's
that's where I'm thinking. This is a very stream of consciousness podcast.
No, that's a really big and that's a really amazing question as to whether people could, right before they use the software, shape their own experience of it so that it becomes useful to them and again enables them to reach their potential, as it were, almost like a her situation, where you have this operating system and you just shape it as it goes along. Again, we've seen that in popular culture in terms of something, that could work, and I'm sure that there are people that are working on something like that at the moment. It's a shame, isn't it? You're right. It's a total balancing act with Facebook because, now Facebook, it has shareholders and it has to satisfy its shareholders economically as at the same time satisfying its huge user base. And these technologies, the success of these technologies is largely based on the size of its user base and, whether the extent to which that user base is actually using the site or using the application or the products or not. And so there is a really fine balance, I think. But I think it's a little bit unfair to say that actually that we're creating these technologies and that that these technologies are having a necessarily bad impact on us. I think to a large extent, the technology just exists on its own. I wouldn't be a technological determinist, as it were. I don't think technologies have agency in and of themselves. I think that absolutely they're engineered for us to use them more, but the way that we use them, the way that I think if we're being compelled to use the technology more, then certainly the onus then is on the engineer and also on the user to let their voice be heard, that actually what we want are better experiences, right? If you do have shareholders to satisfy, then create better experience for me, create a healthier experience for me, create a more compassionate experience for me. I don't want to go like Ask FM, for example, I don't want to use a platform where I'm going to get shot down by lots and lots of trolls, and I just feel, I
Yeah.
just feel awful every time I use it, right? So I think, like you say, maybe it's a bit of balance, maybe there's a role or responsibility on the part of the user to make their voice heard insofar as this is what we want, and then also from the side of the engineers that we need to do better in creating compelling but also healthy and wise applications.
Well, I completely agree with that perspective. And another thing that I'm very conscious of, especially having listened to what Tim Berners-Lee said last year when he called for sort of an Internet Bill of Rights or the Magna Carta to end surveillance culture, sort of critically aware of the fact that while we're talking about these ideas of creating more healthy experiences and enabling people to increase their empathy and compassion, etc., that there's also that element which Berners-Lee talked about of cultural sensitivity, which some have taken to means allowing people to have a certain number of rights as long as it's within the diktats of their country. And I think that's something else that's really interesting to look at in terms of us believing the web to be something which is or should be universally available, and universally available in its same form to all, global citizens. But then actually, when we're looking at the laws of various countries, there are going to be things that limit certain people's rights more than others. I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts around that and how we can kind of, I don't know, maybe level the playing field so people get access to similar things, or whether that's possibly not even attainable as a goal.
It's a really interesting thing. I'm actually so for example, I'm actually writing a book like you at the moment on this idea of happiness versus meaning.
That's juicy.
And and it's absolutely fascinating. And just a very quick précis of it is that there was a study conducted very recently by a person called Roy Baumeister. And basically what he discovered was that we're addicted to good feelings. We're addicted to good feelings, and we associate that with happiness. And we associate basically bad feelings with being unhappy. What the research actually showed is that when people focus their attention on meaning or what's important to them, or again, what the philosophers would call eudaimonic happiness,
yes,
then we become happy by default. We start to experience these good feelings. And when we do chase meaning, that we become more emotionally resilient and our happiness becomes much stronger. And so, but what I found from this research also is that happiness changes when you go into different cultures. So the Eastern conception of happiness is rooted in the community. It's rooted in making the community happy. It doesn't encourage things like, in general, it doesn't encourage things like individualism, doesn't encourage people to stand out from the crowd, to have our own experience. Even it doesn't encourage people to be too happy or too sad, because that, again, that imbalances the equation or the harmony of the group. Whereas over in the West, we focus much more on self-actualization, self-esteem, individualism, good feelings. These are the things that make us happy. And so I think if you relate that to the web, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because you can't have a web where you have Web 2.0 where you can publish anything you want, you can have your own opinion, but then does that really fit in a society where it's all about harmony, and it's about maintaining the status quo, and that's really, and again, I think that's really interesting. And so again, what we've seen from the research is that the web as it exists at the moment in China, we talk a lot about the Great Firewall of China and how the Chinese have this incredibly technically sophisticated wall, and they have the 50 Cent army that's also looking at what people write. But what you actually find is that there's lots of self-censorship that goes on. That internally, in general, people in China understand this whole idea of harmony. They understand how it's important for the balance of the unity of the state. And so people self-censor themselves. And so they've kind of, as you say, they've made their own version of the web where they understand, almost like they're ambassadors. Every time they post something, it's like it goes out into the world and they're representing China. And
it's almost as though this self-censoring, it reminds me of the kind of behaviours that one sees when you look at things like the panopticon, the idea that it was like a prison that was designed so there was a watchtower that overlooked the prisoners. And the trick with the watchtower was that the prisoners couldn't see at any given point whether there was someone watching them or whether there wasn't, which of course provided the perfect psychological context within which people would behave properly, or as they were required to do. Because if you didn't know if they were there or if they weren't there, in terms of these guards, you acted as if they were, because the outcome of not acting as if they were would have been punishment. So it's kind of this idea of, taken from that extreme, and also sort of this idea of the Truman syndrome of feeling like we're constantly being surveilled, or we have to behave in certain ways so as to forego negative consequences and perhaps reap rewards. It's interesting to hear you speak about it in that positive context where people are electing to do it because there's that choice of foregoing their individual rights in order, or individual gratification almost, for the greater harmony of the wider society. It's a really interesting perspective to consider from someone who is quite individualist. Yeah, fascinating. I like being challenged. It's kind of making my brain wince.
It is interesting, actually, if you consider that, because then, I guess then from that perspective, what the NSA and GCHQ are doing is benevolent, right? That they're looking, from that perspective. Leap. Yeah, I leapt right there.
But it's a good leap. It's a good challenging leap, because yes, you're quite right. It's kind of, I suppose the question is, where do you draw the line, and then at which point in an sort of autonomous, more individualistic society, if that's the culture that we're led to believe that we have, and then the people who are in charge of being the guardians of that society that we give power to enable to protect that, if they then undermine it or subvert it in covert ways, then I think that's where the tension comes in, and where actually there is a violation being made.
I think you're absolutely right. I just think that the problems that we're experiencing now in the West, things like, we're hyper connected, but at the same time we feel disconnected. We're like asking, we're trying to figure out, how we can produce more, how we can be more creative, more innovative, yet we're spending so much time behind screens. We don't actually know yet whether all of this time behind screens is actually beneficial for society or whether it's not, and we're still finding that out. And these strands are something that I'm finding permeates kind of global society, as it were, East and West culture. And so that's really kind of the question I'm asking with this digital mindfulness, or rather, what are these intersections between practical wisdom and our creation of technology? Because I think that the answers that come from this, and again will appear in the book that I write at the end of the year, that I think they'll be really very important, not only for people and the way that they live their lives generally, but also how organizations are run.
This book is sorely needed, and we'll have you back on the show, maybe on some events to publicize it, because it's just a conversation that really needs to be had, and across all these disciplines. I think we really are reaching a tipping point for the people who are kind of forging ahead to be able to spark the debate and create wider conversations around how we actually harness this for our good and for the greater good, and that's a very worthwhile cause. You're very inspiring.
Thank you very much.
So I realised that we're coming to time, and I kind of wanted to let you speak more rather than ask you some of these questions. But I do have to ask you one final question, because I'm really interested in this, before we move to the quickfire round.
Sure.
And that's to ask you, which book or idea has had the biggest impact in your life so far?
Oh, okay.
Not too big of a question.
I think if it's the book that has had the biggest impact on me, I would say it's The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. And the reason it has had such a big impact on me is that it's such a small book, but it's utterly profound. It's affected political leadership just throughout the centuries, from the Medici right until now, the Pax Americana. And I think just what it really underscores to me is that the kind of universality and the timelessness of human nature.
Well, that was very beautifully written. I might have to go and beautifully written. You can tell I'm thinking about writing. Instead, I'm going to have to sort of revisit that. So, on that note, we're going to go somewhere completely different, into the quickfire round. So these are 5 either/or questions. Are you happy?
Okay, no problem.
Certainty or adventure?
Adventure.
Relative or absolute?
Absolute.
Self or other?
Other.
Starter or dessert?
Dessert.
And present or future?
Oh, future.
Fascinating. They're quite tricky, aren't they?
What do they show? Do you know more about me, having asked me that?
Well, no, it's just, presumably, yes, I know your choice out of those two forced choice questions. But it was just really just out of curiosity. I kind of thought these are kind of things that I find interesting to ask people over cocktails or several whiskies. So I thought, why not include it in the podcast? That's literally the only reason. I should do some research on it. Yeah. So for everyone listening, if you want to carry on this fantastic conversation with Lawrence, you're welcome to ask him any questions on Twitter at Ampofo using the hashtag #GoodBadDirty. I'm also going to include the links for his Twitter and LinkedIn profile, as well as digitalmindfulness.net and semanticaresearch.com, which are the two websites. Lawrence, it's been such a pleasure. Is there anything else that people should check out? And what are the dates, crucially, for the Mindfulness Conference if people want to come along?
Great, thank you. So the dates are the 18th and the 19th of March at Senate House in London. And for the Americans, I haven't decided exactly the dates yet, but we'll be putting those up on digitalmindfulness.net for the San Francisco conference. But that will certainly be in July.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you like this episode, make sure you go to my website, thewebpsychologist.com/show-notes to get links to all the resources we mentioned, as well as updates on future shows. If you enjoyed the podcast, please spread the word and rate or review it on iTunes. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #GoodBadDirty. Thanks for listening.